is it feels like because there aren't consequences right now for a lot of elected representatives who don't tell the truth, and I would argue, at some point, especially in the partisan system, because, to get a nomination, it feels like you have to be more, and this isn't right or it just feels generally now you have to be more extreme. You have to be more, you know, out there and try to generate more, and not always anger, but excitement, which can
Can
be
you,
anger.
yeah, can you give an example? Because like feel the opposite. I feel that parties want people that have no personality, that have never said anything wrong, that are like boring, and then people don't want to engage because they're like, well, that person is boring and it's not anything interesting. So I actually think we need people that are a little bit more spicy so that people get involved. I don't even care what the issue is anymore.
Right.
I just want the conversation. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dialogue Over Division. And I have with me today another local councillor from Edmonton. And I'm very pleased to have with me Andrew Knack, who I believe is a pretty long-time councillor in Edmonton. So I'd like to delve into that, how long you've been on the council, what was the main reason you started, and then I think you mentioned you're not going to be running again. So if we could explore all of that too, that'd be great. But I'll turn it over to you, Andrew, and let us know how long it's been now that you've been on council with the city of Edmonton.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And so yes, I'm Andrew Knack. I'm very fortunate to be serving as the city councillor for Ward Nakota-East for about another 9 months. I first got elected in 2013 and actually ran twice before. Ran once in 2007, lost horribly. Ran again in 2010. Didn't lose quite as horribly, and then tried again in 2013, and was fortunate to have the chance to serve, and been reelected twice since then. And we're at a point now that by the end of this term, it'll be 12 years. And as much as I love it, and I truly, to this day, I want to do nothing more with my life than to do this role and to serve in this role. I think it's a phenomenal opportunity. It's a great privilege to get to serve others, but at the same time, I think you worry about wearing out your welcome at some point. I don't think we have to look much further than what's happening federally, what's happening in the U.S., what's happening pretty much across the world, where what I find is it's not so much a shift in any particular political direction. It's a shift towards whoever's not the incumbent. So I think there does come a point where it is important to have new perspectives and new ideas, and that's part of why I think it's time for me to step aside in this role and let somebody else take over and do the best they can.
Well, I really want to get into that a lot about your thoughts on that, because I have some other thoughts on what's going on. So I'd like to
Sure.
get into that. But before we go there, I do want to hear a little bit more. Like you said, you really love the role. So what is it that you love about the role of being a city councillor? And maybe too, what are some things that surprised you when you took on this job and this role? So if what were the good things, the highlights?
And I know this will sound a little bit like a fake answer, but it is pretty much everything. And I mean that it's yes, there are times where there are certain parts of our meetings that can feel a little bit tedious, but overall the actual ability to go into those meetings and have an opportunity to have an impact is really exciting to me. Just like it's really great to be able to go out into the community and connect with people, to hear from one another, to hear different perspectives, because I don't have all the answers, and it's nice to learn from other folks. In particular, and this is one of the reasons I ran back in 2007. I was 23 at the time, but hearing from younger voices. So I was 23. I ran, but part of what I've loved since I've been on council, I got elected when I was 29, is getting to be involved with groups like the City of Edmonton Youth Council, which I know when you had your chat with, I think, Councillor Stevenson, she talked a bit about that. I was the council rep on that group for the first 8 years of my time on council, and to see these folks who are 13 to 23 years old who get to provide actual policy recommendations to council. It's every aspect. It's going into seniors' residences and talking with the seniors there who have a lot of life experience and wisdom to share. It's to deal with land use bylaws, which I know for a lot of folks can be really boring, and yet it's so important from what the city does. So really, most of the things that I get to do every day, it's even replying to the calls and emails, even the ones that are maybe they're not as happy about what you've done, because getting a chance to actually engage them gives a chance to learn from one another. And so I love all of that. I think the only thing that's really surprised me at this point, and this is more of a more recent occurrence over the last couple of years, really since the start of the pandemic, is, and again, unsurprisingly, it's happening across the world, is where we find people who are a little less willing to actually hear one another, a little less willing to actually engage in a discussion. And that's hard. I even just last night, there were comments on my Facebook, a couple of Facebook posts about snow removal that I was replying to. And, some of them were, you're an idiot. Okay, well, it's like, all right, sure, and fine, call me an idiot. I don't really care.
All the time.
Yeah, and like, I don't
You're
care.
an elected official.
Yeah, but what I find is that far more now in the last couple of years, it's that when I then engage, because I'll even engage those folks who call me an idiot, I'll say, hey, well, what's your concern? Why am I an idiot? What don't you like? It used to be that actually that would sometimes cause somebody to take a step back and say, oh, wait a second, this is a real person who is actually taking the time to reply to me. I'm going to take some time to share what I actually have concerns about. Now it's becoming a little less, there's a little less willingness to actually engage when being reached out to. And so that's the part that's surprising, because, and maybe I shouldn't be shocked, but it's, most of my time on council and before I was on council, I think that was far more prevalent than we are seeing right now. And that's a little disappointing, especially somebody that's sort of over my life has changed has very different and diverse political views, because I grew up very, very on the right side of the spectrum. Now I think some people would consider me more on the left side of the spectrum, but there are ideas that I still support on the right. There are ideas that I support on the left. And so to come with that sort of experience of being across the political spectrum, it's hard when you're not getting a chance to actually dig into what people have issues about, and to not hear from people who have concerns.
I'm really excited to have this conversation because, just so the viewers know, I don't think we've really ever met Andrew, but we have had a couple exchanges on Twitter. And I think at the first exchange, I was like, let's have a discussion. And that took a while, and we are finally here. So that's great. But there's so much to say about this issue. And I'm not even comfortable with the words right and left, or what those mean anymore. And I'd really like to get into that with you, because you did talk about that. The other thing you mentioned is how citizens are now reacting. And maybe we could start with that. Unless, of course, you have anything else you want to say about specifically City of Edmonton or your role, because I think this could get quite interesting, and I'm really interested to get into that kind of discussion.
Let's do it. Let's get into it.
Great. So this has been a question I've been posing for a while: chicken and the egg scenario. Who's really at fault here? Because I feel that in Canada, very much citizens haven't been very engaged. And then they got more engaged. But a lot of citizens, including myself, I found that elected officials dismiss and, moreover, disparage citizens. And so when that's coming from our elected officials who are meant to be representing us, citizens, I think citizens then feel disempowered. They feel that, like, why would they have a respectable conversation with elected officials when that's what elected officials are, how they're responding to their citizens or how they're acting to their citizens. And I'm going to add one more thing, is I think elected officials honestly should be on a higher pedestal. They're being paid by taxpayers. And so for elected officials to stoop down to that name-calling level to the very citizens that pay them, I just can't get over how that became acceptable. And for the last 5 years, which is when you notice there was a rise in citizens responding, maybe not the most kindly, I think that they were responding in turn from what they were seeing from elected officials. So your thoughts on that?
I mean, 100% agree. Like, I mean, that's part of what I've loved about municipal politics is because we don't have parties, at least, well, we haven't had parties until this year, and that's going to be a different conversation. Uh, I think it's really allowed people to enter into a conversation without sort of a preconceived notion. Doesn't mean you don't have particular leanings, but ideally it's allowed me, at least in particular, to go into a meeting and say, oh, I hadn't considered this idea. And I think provincially and federally I think the entire partisan system is broken at this point. I think it is so far removed from what the average person actually wants. And yet, because nobody, like, we're caught up in this situation where I think you're right. This has been led by folks in elected roles and across the political spectrum. This is a issue on the right, center, left. It doesn't up, down. Like, I see it in almost every party, a lot of different people, not all of them, to be very clear, but there's enough people who are so regularly insulting or disparaging to people of a different party, to average citizens, you name it, that it has sort of normalized this world where that's almost like what people are seeking out right now, to say, well, if everyone's doing it, then I'm just going to go and support my team, which is also doing it, but I support their policies, so therefore I'm going to generally accept it. And I think we've reached a really sad point where, I think elected representatives used to be held to a much higher standard. If you were so much as found, really blatantly lying, I mean, then oftentimes there was enough public pressure from people across the political spectrum to say, no, you got to go. And now that almost seems like it's a prerequisite to be able to serve, is that you have to be willing to do that. And
sorry, I missed it.
To not tell the truth. It feels like elected representatives are almost rewarded now for behavior we wouldn't accept from kids in a school.
So I think we need to talk about actual examples, because I'm not really following here. And maybe just because you started with the partisan system is broken, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. And this is a conversation I did have with Councillor and Stevenson a bit more, or a little bit. And I don't know if you heard that, but like for me, it's just that I think that what's happened in our party systems is, it's become very like a team, and somebody can't express a view. So I think we have to, and I'm all about solutions. I think if there's a problem, let's identify it like adults and talk about solutions. And I think there's an opportunity to make those party systems better. I think there's pros and cons, and I don't really want to spend the whole time talking about that, because like I said, I think where there's a problem, we can find a solution. But you did say that party systems aren't necessarily I think you were saying they don't kind of encapsulate what the average citizen wants. So maybe if you could explain what you mean there, and then we could go into what you were talking about.
Sure. Let's, and this will be a fun example, because I'm going to pick on both sides of the spectrum, and we'll just focus on Canadian politics. We'll set aside American or other examples, but currently today, we have both a prime minister in Canada and we have a premier in Alberta who have both violated the same conflict of interest rules. And
so let's break that down then, if you want to use that as an example. Because, what do you mean by they both? Number one, there's two different conflict of interest acts. One would be federal and one would be provincial. So on the surface, they didn't break the same thing. So
correct. Yeah. I mean, they broke their version of it. One federal, one provincial.
Let's talk about what it is that you believe the prime minister, how he breached the conflict of interest act. Which example are you providing?
So there were the example on the prime minister, I believe, is when how he was handling the situation with Jody Wilson-Raybould, and I'm drawing a blank on the other person's name off the top of my head. And
the pressure he put on her attorney general to withdraw criminal charges against LNG, that large corporate.
Exactly. And both in his example and the provincial example, you have an independent body that did that investigation and came to that determination.
What's the example for Premier Smith, just so that we're clear?
Hers was when she had been contacting Minister Shandro, and so in that report, it talked about how essentially what she did was very similar to what Prime Minister Trudeau did.
Okay.
And
So
I think,
just so
yeah,
we're clear on that one,
yep,
that's the first I actually ever heard that there was information that she was directly contacting Minister Shandro. So that was in the report 100%. My understanding was she was talking to the individual that was charged.
yeah. And I think, I would need to pull up the report, but I know the report talked about whether it was, I don't know if she had the conversation with Minister Shando or somebody from the office, but there was enough of a concern that had been raised by the person investigating that they suggested and came to the conclusion that they had violated the provincial version of the Conflict of Interest Act.
Yeah.
And
So one more
sure,
point on that, because I took a very different view with how that conversation went and what happened, and maybe I could just give you my view, and then what I would like to know too is how you think it should have been handled then. So
yeah,
how I viewed Premier Smith speaking to an individual that was charged, I think that we should encourage that as civic engagement and our elected representatives actually talking to these people. I think that vilifying Canadians is so off. And I don't know if you know, but individual inmates can vote. If you're charged with murder, pedophilia, all these things, and you're in prison, you can still vote for your elected representative. So I had a very hard time when people were vilifying an elected official for speaking to somebody that maybe was unsavory, that then, turned on the person. But I don't think that helps the conversation for civic engagement. So it's one thing to be talking to an individual, whether they're unsophisticated or not, because I can tell you that now elected officials, like I was saying, are so hesitant to talk to people because they're going to be, what's going to happen in the media? How is this going to be spun? And I think fundamentally that's wrong. So that's what the position I took on Premier Smith's thing. I didn't, like I say, hear that she was speaking directly to the Minister of Justice at the time. So if that's part of it, then that's totally different. But my view on her speaking to citizens is it should never be disparaged. And oh my goodness, how that went, like those actions, terrible, awful. And I think that was wrong. So with that aspect, what are your thoughts on whether or not elected officials should be talking to even the unsavory or those charged, having those conversations?
yeah. And so I think when it comes to having conversations with folks, generally speaking, I think elected representatives should have as many as they can. And I think, there will always come to, I'm sure each person will have their own personal line, but I think about the way I've worked over my 12 years, almost 12 years, is, I host open town halls. Anyone's welcome. Anyone can come and speak. Anyone can come and ask questions. I'm not there to shut folks down. Similarly, even just last week, I'm not running again, but I'm still out door knocking. I've gone door knocking throughout my entire term, each term. And the point behind that is you go and connect with as many different people as possible, including the ones that hate you.
Right.
I've gone to knock on doors where, I remember 10 years ago, they didn't have very nice things to say about me. And 10 years later, I remember those doors, and instead of ignoring them, I go to them.
Right.
And why? Because you represent everyone. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree with you. You campaign on certain things and folks elect you to ideally accomplish certain things. But at the end of the day, I think it's still your job to go and be in front of as many different people, to hear from as many people, to inform yourself, because maybe there is something you learn that can help impact a decision. So I think
Even get that relationship going with people that are disenfranchised. And so that's what I'd like to hear, whether, it
yeah.
sounds like that's the right way to go, right?
Yeah, and so absolutely, I have less of an issue with that, and so using both the examples we were just talking about, and I was just trying to pull it up to confirm, but I believe in the report it does talk about the interactions with the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, both provincially and federally, in both examples. And so, to me, when going back to that question about the partisan system, is that and why I think we have a flaw in it right now is that I think folks are unwilling to hold their own team accountable anymore. And I don't think that used to be the case 10 or 15 years ago, even, where even if somebody from your team did something that was, verifiable, not what you would want from your elected representatives, we would want to have somebody new come in and serve, because there's, millions of people in this province. There's tens of millions of people in this country. There's over 1 million people in Edmonton. I'm not the I'm not the only one who can do this job by any stretch. And to me, if I'm found myself to be in that situation, you would hope you would say, well, no, I shouldn't be here because I should be letting somebody else serve
Right.
that haven't done that. So that's the issues that I worry that we've gotten so caught up in saying, okay, this isn't good, but I'm okay with it because I really don't like the other side more. And that is an issue both, I think, at an individual level, and I think it's an issue within the parties. I mean, right now we're seeing in the liberal leadership race how many people can run away from the positions of the prime minister as they run for leadership, and you have to ask yourself, saying, well, why didn't you say those things before? To your point, but earlier, where was your willingness to speak up about a policy you disagreed with, and can we not at least set up a system where, I get you have to be a bit of a team in a partisan system, but it doesn't mean that you have to give them your undying loyalty at all costs.
Yeah.
And that's what I really worry about, that we have in a partisan system that so far hasn't materialized in a municipal system where you don't have parties. And I really enjoyed that about our system.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I can understand that aspect, obviously. So let's just go back to, because, the other thing that is a little different between the two examples is I think the prime minister has had more than one conflict of interest reached.
Yeah.
But so what should we have seen if things were working correctly with, because I really do believe that the LNG issue was a very serious breach of conflict of interest. Like, if there's a scale, that's on the high end, and as a result, the attorney general had to resign because she felt that uncomfortable with what was going on, or she was kicked out, whatever the story was. But so what should we have seen if things were working correctly?
I think it would have been, when you're found in violation of a serious issue like that, no matter who you are,
Breaching of the conflict
of interest, right? I think
Yeah.
when you find that as something as serious as that, the party members, the other caucus members should have been demanding they step aside. I think the public should have been speaking about that as well. And ideally, then both anyone who is found in violation, so at the time our prime minister, should have stepped aside, because he was in violation of a pretty serious rule, right? I mean, I think back to, before I was on council, and I don't know the story 100% well, but I remember it was when that Bev Oda was a minister federally, and she got in a lot of flack for a $16 orange juice, right? And I think she actually ended up getting pushed out, essentially, by her fellow party members as well as citizens, because they found that, what was it, just a $16 orange juice, or was it the fact that somebody felt like, hey, that was a reasonable thing? And I think there was a lot of pushback from across party lines saying, no, we have to hold our elected representatives to a higher standard. And that was, about 10, 15 years ago. And now we're at the point where it's not even that somebody's buying a $16 glass of orange juice, where folks are found in serious conflict of interest, and that's not even getting them to step aside. Yes. And that's what worries me. It's seemingly this boiling water analogy, that we've almost got used to just such worse and worse behavior that we're almost willing to accept it now because we think that everyone's like that. And I don't believe that's the case. I genuinely don't. Most of the MPs and MLAs I know in the partisan system are good people from across party lines, but they're so caught up in a system and a structure that forces them to just go along with what's happening. And that's where I think the flaw is. So what should have happened is that anyone that was found in a violation should have been required to step down, and somebody new should have been put in.
Well, I don't know if you know about my book, Reconnect to Canada. So it's actually meant to get people civically engaged and get a little bit better understanding of the legal and political system. And I actually take it, think, one step further. In the afterword, I provide ideas for reforms. And one is if an elected official is found to have breached the conflict of interest, that commissioner and that group should be empowered to also sanction the representative, because you could give teeth to that person that, or there, or it could be even part of the criminal code, depending on the severity of the conflict. So there are a lot of ways, but that's the thing, is that I don't see people calling for that kind of reform or even having that conversation. So it is a bit unfortunate too.
The last person I remember having that conversation, and I actually bought a membership to vote for him in the federal conservative race, was Michael Chong, who talked a lot about trying to decentralize the power from the prime minister's office. And goodness gracious, I wish that happened. And he didn't get anywhere close to winning that vote, and disappointing, because I think the message and the idea that he was talking about was trying to make sure there was more power in the hands of individual MPs, so that it wasn't just really the prime minister controls all, and we see that provincially as well, where not just here in Alberta, it's across the country, where premiers seem to have a great deal of control now as well, and what happened, like where did the accountability piece go, and why did we suddenly get to a point now where it feels like we have such centralized decision-making power in one group, which is hard.
Yeah, and I'm with you on all of this, and maybe Mr. Chong, sorry I missed the name, but maybe he was
Michael Chong, yeah.
Michael Chong was a bit too early for his time,
I
because
think so, yeah.
These things will be a bit more welcome now. But it is interesting what you're saying, that things kept getting worse and worse. And I'm going back to my chicken and the egg scenario, because, and maybe out of all of the parties, I think that the party that I fault the most fault with is our media, because I think that they really amplify the voices of division and that shaming and censoring. And if you misstep one thing, then it's a snowball's chance with what's going to happen later. And I don't think that helped elevate the conversation in Canada very well. Elected officials then became very hesitant in what they're saying, what they're doing. Then they had to have this polished image, and only one person could speak on behalf of others, because then they're going to say something wrong, and immediately everything's wrong. And I don't think that helped the conversation. So that's kind of where I fell on, to who I would blame a little bit more. I think everyone's has a little bit why I focused on education with Canadians is because I think we just need to elevate the basic level of conversation in this country. So citizens have a role to play in doing better. Elected officials have a role to play in doing better. The judiciary, I think, has a role to play in doing better, even just being more open and transparent with how their proceedings, so Canadians can follow along. But ultimately, I think a little bit the media didn't help with the shame and blame and amplifying that. As an elected official, did you find that you were hesitant with how you approach people? Did the media help or hinder, do you feel, in your role to engage?
I would say that the challenge I found with local media, because I find and this is the issue, the very few local media staff that still exist are doing as good of a job as they can covering City Hall. The problem is, when I first started 11 years ago, it was common that there were at least 6 or 7 members of the media from many different platforms, many different outlets rather, sitting in chambers, watching every second of our meeting, watching how we acted, how we behaved, and were able to report on that. Now what happens is, there will occasionally be, a couple of media members who come into a council chambers to watch what they're doing. Some of them are watching online, but it's at the lunch break where you get 5 or 6 of them will come and do an interview, and then they're gone for the day. And I don't blame them, because those our local media outlets have essentially been just decimated. There is no local coverage anymore to the extent which we want, which is part of why it's important to engage with other groups and find other ways to connect, because there are people who don't read the local media anymore, or the traditional local media, the Journal and the Sun. I mean, they're owned by the same entity. They're not really different. the radio stations are combined. There's so few actual unique mainstream outlets anymore. I don't have an issue with what they do, because what I've experienced locally is they still ask tough questions, they do their work, but there's only a handful of them. And so that has created this information vacuum in what we do. And I think it reinforces why, as elected representatives, we need to be out even more, because I can't rely on, and I shouldn't rely on, the media to get information out there. I want to make sure we're sharing where we can, but we also have to connect directly. It's why I like to host town halls. But so I would answer your question and say, I didn't have a concern with how local media's been doing their job. It's just there's so few of them now that they can't do the same job that they did 15 years ago, when there was such active coverage about what we did every single day.
Well, I would suggest maybe perhaps they weren't very good at changing with the times either, because I think there is very much a demand, and you see it yourself, I think. But I think that if they're gonna, kind of be partisan, which I think we can say that that's happened. I think that there has been, and there still is, a huge opportunity for legacy media, mainstream media, to do these things, but it seems like they chose not to. And so, again, I'm going to put the blame on that. There's a demand for this information. There's independent voices without a budget are able to find success. And we could talk about misinformation and disinformation and all those things and lies, and I would very much like to. But I think that that's exposing who is credible, who is honest, who is providing entertaining value. But when you're giving an outfit a ton of money and they can't produce quality information, credible information, again, I think it's on them. Like, the demand is still there. So something is missing.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I think, I think there's likely a different conversation to be had, sort of how we're covered nationally and nationally in the news and what those are. Because again, my experience is when I read the stories that the reporters put out, even the columnists, like, there's a handful of time where columnists who don't have the same sort of, and I don't mean this in a negative way to them, don't necessarily have the same reporting requirements that a reporter should have in trying to remain unbiased. Columnists can be a little more biased, but even over my years is that there's very few times where I've found, I've read something or watched a story and felt, wow, that is completely opposite to what actually happened in council chambers. And so overall, that's why I've been generally quite happy. And I've seen different reporters come and go over my time on council, different columnists come and go, folks that I've agreed with, folks that I haven't agreed with. And generally speaking, they've all had a desire to try to cover what we do. But we're at that point now where, again, the issue is when you're not in the room anymore for the 8-hour meeting that we have, because you don't have the same, you're a tenth of the staff contingent that you had 10 years ago. How can you then do the best job you would like to making sure everyone has that information? And so I still don't find that the stories that come out of from the more legacy media are incorrect. I think they're just more, they don't get to tell the entire story. And it's part of why I like to do more in-person discussions, like those virtual discussions, because then we can dig in and we can connect people and show people where they can watch it themselves, and then they can hear it for themselves and get the answers to those questions, because it's just not the same as it was.
Yeah, and maybe we could park legacy media, because I do want to talk about them in terms of sometimes when they do very blatantly lie, but not so much on a local level. And this is one thing that I do try to express and remind people as much and as often as possible, is how incredibly important it is to get involved on a local level. And this is just by geography, it's so much easier to get to know your elected officials on a local level. You can even attend town hall meetings and speak at them. You cannot do that on a provincial or a federal level. You can't put up your hand in the parliament and say, "Excuse me, Speaker, I'd like to make a comment here as a citizen." But you can do it with the appropriate channels and commentary period to do that in town halls. And I think that's such a great thing to do. So that's one thing too. Like on a local level, you don't have to rely, I think, on the mainstream media as much because by geography, by nature, with the technology that we have now, it's a lot easier to connect people, I think. So that's one thing. And so again, just encouraging people. And this is something I actually didn't ask Anne, and I'm wondering, do you have a constituency office, or is it at the city hall? Like, where can Edmontonians, your constituents, go and say hi to you? And
Yeah,
what
great.
does that work?
Great question. So yeah, unlike MLAs and MPs, which typically have a bigger budget for their individuals' offices, we don't. So our offices are just at City Hall. So I sort of call it like I have my informal office. There's 4 or 5 coffee shops that I'll go to, once a week or once every couple of weeks, and just have a bunch of meetings with folks. But no, we don't have standalone offices. But the beauty, and you sort of touched on this, is that although the ward boundaries changed for me, so I'm now technically 5 blocks out of the ward. I used to live in the ward, and then the boundary changed by a few blocks. But I see people when I go to the library. I see people when I go to these spots, and fortunately, having been around long enough now, I'm most people still don't recognize their local councillor, which is a shame. And I don't mean that because I want to be recognized. I mean that because I want people to know they can engage with me. If they see me, I want them to feel comfortable coming up and saying hello and saying I have a question. With the voter turnout the way it is municipally, that there's still a lot of people that don't. When I'm door knocking, there's still a lot of doors that people are, when they first open, they're like, "Who are you?" But even without the ward office, at least we have that ability to get out into the community, and particularly as you mentioned, because it's this local piece. We're in the community all the time.
Right.
It's harder for an MP because they've got to go to Ottawa for 4 days a week, and then they come back and they're only there for a couple of days. So you're not always going to have the chance to run into them the same way that you would have a chance to run into your councillor, and that's too bad.
Yeah.
But also important why they would probably need to have a constituency office federally, because the MP isn't going to be there all the time.
Yeah, and on a provincial level, I think you could say the same things.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't realize how far, Grand Prairie was until I went there. And the flights aren't as easy sometimes too. So, or even smaller towns where they do not have an airport and these MLAs are driving. So yeah, it is a little different there. And I think it is nice that citizens can go to City Hall and meet with their elected representatives in that setting. I think just security and things provincial. Well, if you're from Grand Prairie, to ask a citizen to drive to Edmonton would be a bit silly to go to the legislature. I do think I saw you riding your bike around the low-level bridge in the summer.
Absolutely. I love driving. I'm too cheap to buy a second car, and it's good for my health. So that's why I like to bike a lot.
I'm a walker. I'm not a biker.
There you go. Hey, that's good.
We could talk about bike lanes, but I think we'll park that conversation.
Because we have time.
I'm
always happy to chat bike lanes.
I know, but yeah, I think ad nauseum it's been talked about, and I don't even know if we've gotten anywhere one way or another. But I do want to talk. You mentioned that you feel that elected officials basically need to lie. So tell me what you mean about that, because that is definitely not what I'm trying to encourage. And why I want people involved is if they're going to just be talking to liars, that doesn't sound very good. So what did you mean by that?
Yeah, what I mean is it feels like because there aren't consequences right now for a lot of elected representatives who don't tell the truth, that and I would argue, at some point, especially in the partisan system, because, to get a nomination, it feels like you have to be more, and this isn't right or it just feels generally now you have to be more extreme. You have to be more, out there and try to generate more, and not always anger, but excitement, which can be anger.
Yeah, can you give an example? Because I feel the opposite. I feel that parties want people that have no personality, that have never said anything wrong, that are boring, and then people don't want to engage because they're like, well, that person is boring and it's not anything interesting. So I actually think we need people that are a little bit more spicy so that people get involved. I don't even care what the issue is anymore. I just want the conversation.
Yeah, and they, I don't want to dwell too much on I think U.S. politics, but I feel like that's where it's this
Well,
is
let's get into it, Mr.
yeah,
Newton.
and I mean in the sense of like, and again, you can obviously, and I don't hide the fact I'm not a supporter of the new president, in part because they violated the law, and similar to what we talked about earlier, I think that should be a deal breaker. Um, but I
But it
think
isn't. So,
so and it isn't, sadly, and that is a sadness that I live in this world right now where that isn't a deal breaker. But I think in the U.S. in particular, and I think we're starting to spill over more into Canadian politics, is that for a lot of folks, especially it's different when you're maybe running in a space where there's a lot more independence or a lot more moderate people. You might want to find that person that's a little less, somebody that's going to rock the boat. But it feels like now we're in a place where, unless, if you're running in a seat, so let's pick provincially. If you're running for the nomination in a rural riding, or if you're running in an urban riding for the NDP, or, a conservative riding in the rural, it feels like you almost have to try to tailor to whoever is the most active, which can often be folks that are maybe the most considered extreme. And that almost feels like it's encouraging people to not remember that they represent everyone, not just that sliver of folks that might vote in a nomination race.
so
But
do
it's
you
hard.
have an example? Because, like I said, I really feel that it's the opposite. So, where do
Mhm.
you see that either a nominee as being the most extreme option available?
Well, I mean, I would look at the last conservative leadership race here in the province, right? And, there's, to me, your safe choice would have been Travis Taves. He was the person that doesn't rock the boat. He was the person that felt pretty moderate, arguably moderate in the sense of how he handled himself. And there were other choices. I looked at, Rebecca Schultz and Rajan Sani, and there were other people who would have been considered I think, the more moderate, quote unquote. The UCP voted for Danielle Smith, and the UCP members voted for her. That was who they wanted to represent them. And it felt like, generally her campaign was tailored more towards those who were focused on, who had memberships and were going to vote, which I get why you would do that, right? Like in a party system, you have to get the nomination before you can even begin to make change. But it sure feels like we've developed a system that you sort of tailor your message one way when you're trying to win a nomination. And then often once you get it, you're trying to like pivot into a different direction instead of just being the same person, no matter which way, no matter whether you're running for a nomination or running for a regular seat. And again, I don't just want to pick on the premier. I think there's
But let's,
plenty of examples.
she's the leader and
Yeah.
she's a public figure.
You
And
want, but yeah, I think this is evident across the board. I think this is
yeah, but
evident.
yeah, so you said that Travis Taves, Rebecca Schultz were more moderate. So what is it that you saw Danielle Smith saying that was more extreme then?
Well, I think there were a lot of people who had questions about her discussion around the Sovereignty Act, and I get there. There are some people who
But is
really
that
like that message.
extreme or is that representing Albertans? Like that's what I'd like to understand
Yeah,
what
yeah,
was extreme.
yeah. I think and again, each person's going to have their own perspective. I think, and we're having this discussion right now, sort of nationally, and there are people who have concerns with her approach, and there are people who are saying, well, you've got to be Team Canada 100%, and then there's other people saying, well, what about do you be Team Canada even at the expense of essentially Team Alberta? And I've been of the mindset that I don't care that the premier is meeting with the president. I think actually that should be something we encourage, assuming you're trying to generally coordinate a message. Just like if I had a chance to meet with any of the federal leaders, I wrote about this on social media about a week ago. I said, if I had a chance to sit down with Pierre Poilievre or, Justin Trudeau or whoever the next leader of the Liberal Party is, or the leader of the NDP, I would absolutely take it. Why? Because I want to make sure I get to talk about the things that are important to the people that I'm serving. Looking at, I think, some of how our premier has taken this, I get why some people really like her message, because they feel that, you should be sort of Alberta first. And this is a bit of this national conversation of are you an Albertan first or are you a Canadian first? And, my answer is I'm a Canadian first, but there are people who say I'm an Albertan first. And so I imagine depending on where you are in that camp, you're going to either like what's happening or feel that that if you're Canada first, maybe you're not working together and coordinating a message. And I think that's a challenge in this, right? So it's that right now, again, I'll go back to the point that maybe that's the right strategy. Are we working together on developing how you work on that strategy? There was a meeting of all the premiers and the prime minister, what was it, just last week? We're the only province that didn't sign off on that message. Does that create challenges more broadly for all of us as Canada if we do it that way? But at the same time, does that protect Albertans more? These are important conversations, but again, it feels like we're just rushing to, once something happens, we immediately rush to whatever direction our camp is, and then we start having hot takes, and then we start getting instead of taking a step back and say, okay, why did you do this? Why did you do this? How did you talk about this? Why couldn't we get to a point of agreement on that? That's what I think is missing. And so it's, again, we're pushing to just react and sort of respond to sort of the most engaged. And I would say this comes back to sort of our central theme here is that's happening primarily online. Because when I go in person and have a face-to-face conversation, or when I have a town hall meeting, even those that are on one side of the spectrum and those that are on the other side of the spectrum often come into that meeting, listen to one another, hear each other, and then come out of that meeting, maybe not agreeing still, but having a greater appreciation. Yeah. But online, there's no opportunity for nuance. There's no...
Well, I wanted to have a conversation.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
Yeah. But so I very much agree, and I like how you said that it's reactive. So people have been reacting to Premier Smith going to the States and not being part of the agreement. But let's then talk about how I think it's very silly, Doug Ford's reaction to the possible tariff. His proposal was he's going to pull American alcohol off the shelves of the LCBO. It's alcohol that the LCBO taxpayers have already paid money for. Who is it harming really in that? I think that's a silly reaction that doesn't benefit anybody and only harms the taxpayer because, again, they paid for it. And then also today we've seen federally that I don't think the federal government has even figured out what they're doing. And speaking of online, like they're also, we don't even know what's happening yet. And I think they're adding fuel to the fire. So I don't think the reaction from the federal government or even the first ministers coming together in advance of knowing anything, or like, first, what is the problem? Then let's figure out a solution. So the reaction to Premier Smith, sure, there's could be a variety, but then why aren't we holding the federal government or Doug Ford's proposal to the same questionable standard of what are you doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, and I think the question is that happening? I mean, I think I see a lot of online commentary, and again, this is the problem is solely online. I see a lot of people online offering criticisms of the federal government about
no, this is from the elected officials themselves, so from the federal government, from Doug Ford himself, not from those criticizing them. So
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. It's very reactive. Again, not even knowing whether the tariff's going to come into place for sure. But it's kind of threatening, like, we're going to get them back. This is what we're going to... Is that going to help in the end? Or possibly having a conversation with, like Premier Smith did, having conversations with some of the incoming cabinet and forging relationships so that when and if something happens, then you have the ability to manage that situation a little bit more appropriately.
Yeah, and I, just for me, and I'm not the expert in international relations. This is part of why I love municipal. That we get to deal with some very more localized pieces. But again, part of why I said I don't have a problem with her meeting with folks. The question is, is she coordinating? Is she engaging the Prime Minister's office, saying, "Hey, I have an audience of these governors. I'm going to be meeting with them. what are you thinking about? What's your message? They might not agree with each other a lot, but are they talking to each other before those meetings are happening? Just like, I mentioned my example. If suddenly tomorrow I had a chance to sit down with Pierre Poilievre, I wouldn't just sit down with him without engaging our mayor or council and say, hey, I've got an audience. What are some of our key messages? Council's talked about what we want federally, and it's public information about what we're trying to advocate for. But I would want to make sure I'm not sort of stepping on the toes of my council colleagues. I want to make sure that we're actually being thoughtful about what we're doing. Is that happening? I don't know. I haven't really seen a lot of the details on it. So I would, again, in the interest of not rushing the judgment, I'd like to know what that is. But using myself as a personal example, is that when I get a chance to meet with folks in other elected roles, I try to make sure I'm talking with my other colleagues to say, hey, I've got a chance to meet with folks. Here's what they wanted to meet on. Anything else I should know? Any ideas?
Right. Well, I think there's nothing stopping the federal government. In fact, they should be having those conversations directly. But I think too, like being open and transparent too, is important. I think a little bit, like the first minister's meeting was a little bit rushed. I think it would have been really great for the Canadian public to hear more of that instead of, just the little question answer period. It would have been great to hear a dialogue between premiers and the federal government, just so that Canadians, like you said, I think all of this should be open and transparent anyway. But oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think, it feels like our discussion is primarily me picking on the partisan system. But I think part of another example that you just shared and part of, I think, why I have the challenge with the system that we have is that, municipally, the vast majority of what we do is in public. There are absolutely times where we go into private and there are certain FOIP rules that we are required to follow. But in terms of the opportunity, it's far, far more limited than what you see provincially and federally. Essentially, once you go into cabinet meetings, those are always behind closed doors, right? Municipally, we debate the budget publicly. There's nothing that is a public discussion. The information is public. So before we finalize anything, you see a draft budget, and you could argue, provincially and federally, technically they release a draft budget and then it's finalized in the House or the Ledge. But realistically, it has been created behind closed doors with cabinet almost exclusively, and then it's essentially released. And that is a flaw, I think, in the process. I get there will always be times provincially and federally that you might need to meet in private, but it's done so regularly. It feels like it's so normalized that I think that's a big loss that we have in our political system. Whereas I would much rather see provincially and federally them follow far more of the municipal rules, which doesn't mean they can never go in private, but it has to be there has to be a much higher bar to reach that point. And that's not the case right now. And so that goes back to that meeting. I mean, maybe it would have been nice that some of that meeting could have been in public. I mean, I get that you don't want to do everything. You're not going to talk about every single strategy about how to deal with the incoming U.S. administration in public. But could there have been a chance to have some of that to help people better understand how they reach that point? And that's a huge loss that I think we have in our political system right now.
Very much agree with you on that. So openness and transparency I think is vital so that Canadians can get more involved and have confidence in what our elected officials are doing. So we're on the same page there.
Yeah.
Now let's get a bit spicy again, because I'm going to your tweet, and this is the one that I started to have, I think we had a conversation on. So Mr. Knack, on January 26th, almost a year ago today, wow, Tucker Carlson was coming to Alberta, and you had quite some views about that, and I'd like to talk to you about that. But your post was, words matter. Premier Danielle Smith, quote, I wish you would put Stephen Guilbeault in your crosshairs, end quote. This is incredibly dangerous language to use anytime, and particularly troubling considering what happened in Edmonton City Hall this week. And then I invited you on my podcast asking you about why you believe that this is dangerous language.
Yeah, I mean, I think I come back to, at the time a year ago, we were a couple of days removed from somebody coming into City Hall with a lot of weapons, and fortunately no physical damage to any individual. Nobody was harmed physically. Obviously, there's a lot of folks that were around when that was happening that are still dealing with, I can't begin to imagine what that would feel like if you were in the space, close by where somebody had these weapons. And so, yeah, I think I have talked about this, and I get, to your point a little bit earlier, is that spicy, I think, doesn't necessarily mean not thoughtful.
So
And
did you really think that those were dangerous words that she was looking to harm?
no, I
Minister?
don't think she's looking to
Okay.
harm. No. And I think there's no point for me that I think she's trying to actually cause harm to people. But I think, and again, I'm sure I have made a bad choice of words here and there. I'm not going to suggest I'm somehow perfect because I know I'm not. But considering what had just happened in Edmonton, considering the situation, I think it is important to try to think about some of the words that we use and how others can interpret that and understand that, clearly, I don't think most elected officials actually want the people they serve to go and cause harm. I don't believe that is the case in the vast majority of the situation. But I think there are people who are struggling with different challenges, and they can hear language that is used by elected representatives that can cause them to maybe react differently than what might be the average person. And so, yeah, in a situation where, I would try to never use the put somebody in your crosshairs language ever, not just after a serious event. To me, I don't know what that would help in the conversation versus saying, hey, I wish you would put that kind of attention on this guy. Exact same intent, but something that clearly can't be misinterpreted by maybe people who don't have that same understanding.
Yeah, and I was looking at definitions and they all kind of suggest it's figuratively, but I think you could look at the overall, like you know that Premier Smith wasn't looking to cause harm. So to add fuel to the fire there rather than being like, okay, maybe. And I don't even think we should be restricting. And like, this is why I'm all about elevating the conversation rather than shaming or censoring or disparaging people. And I'm not suggesting that's what you were doing, but you were calling attention and just do better. Like, that's what I'm trying to do every day.
Yeah.
I'm not perfect either.
No.
Like, that wasn't her intent. So let's not add fuel to the fire. They're suggesting that those are dangerous words. Then if that was not the intent, whether or not somebody was in the Edmonton City Council hall or not,
I think
it adds problems.
Yeah, I think one of my things and this goes back to sort of how it feels like we've been evolving, maybe not in a good way, around the discourse of politics. And I get it. Everyone's going to have their own approach, but like, I'll use my Facebook page as an example. In my 12,
I have
15,
your Twitter page for again.
yeah.
And that,
Well, I use Facebook as a good example because on Facebook, I every 6 months or so will repost the rules I operate my Facebook page on. And I have some basic rules. For example, I have the language filter set to high because I don't curse. And I'm not telling other people you can't curse, but on my page, you actually can't. Page is going to hide it. And why? Why do I do that? Because I want to encourage, I want younger people to be able to come onto my page and engage in dialogue. I want us to show one another that we can have a serious discussion, a passionate discussion, without having to resort to language that I think we wouldn't strive to do in our regular workplaces or, if it was our kids' classroom. And so, yeah, I guess, some people can call me the language police because I set my language filter to high, but I like to want to have a more respectful dialogue. And so I do think it's important that we're very thoughtful about the language we use. And so, yeah, I get why some people might not like that I express concern when people are disrespectful or use a term that I think is potentially can be harmful. But at the same time, like, I also want to encourage us just to remember that there's so many other words in the English language that we can use to have a good, thoughtful, heated, passionate, fiery discussion, and allow everyone to partake in that, and allow everyone to see that, and to hear it, and to hear the language and read the language and say, hey, these people, boy, they went at it. but gosh, that was respectful. And
Yeah.
why can't we do that? And so, that's why I say on my Facebook page, yeah, you were allowed on my Facebook page to come and call me an idiot. I'm not going to ban you. I'm not going to delete your comment. You can call me an idiot if you want. That doesn't accomplish anything, but I do set a rule that if you call someone else an idiot, if you're going to start name calling other people who are just regular individuals who are there to participate, I will hold you accountable, because I want to encourage you to just be thoughtful with one another, not have to fight. Now, other social media has very different setups. I don't have the same ability on Twitter to address what people say, but on Facebook, I try to curate a space where lots of different perspectives, lots of ideas, and we're all really respectful. And I think the nice thing about it, we've had it for 15 years, that I've had to ban maybe 30 people over the 15 years. It's very, very few people, because most, including people who are not my fans and who have not voted for me anytime, are still there and are still engaging and are still sharing their perspective, because they know that they're welcome to. They just have to be respectful.
Yeah, and I'm with you on all of that too. I think that we can have respectful conversations again. I think I disagree with you that the language used by Premier Smith was of the disrespectful or dangerous category, because that, like, the context around it, not at all was that, nor have her actions ever suggested that. So I just don't think that really elevates let's really focus on when somebody's calling somebody and all those other things. Let's call that out. And I think that's appropriate and fine. And you can have settings on Twitter, by the way.
Yes, you're right. That's true. Yeah. I try not to, I generally like to have people share whatever's on their mind. So.
Yeah. And I agree with you. So I'm going to ask you this then. And this is another post you made. This is in 2022 around the convoy. This is on January 29. There have been numerous pictures of Nazi flags, Canadian flags with swastikas. The Terry Fox statute was defaced. Sorry. Yeah. Anyone attending this would have seen that. I have never accidentally walked into an event where the Nazi flag is being flown. The history of the organizers is well known. I would never be caught doing anything close to an event organized by those who have organized this. So I think you're aware, but I was one of the lawyers for some of the protesters that were in Ottawa. I was in Ottawa at the time, or most of the time. And I'm really disappointed with how elected officials responded. This would be, one of them. Mm-hmm. It was an act of civic engagement, although a little bit unsophisticated, maybe loud. Yeah. But crime went down. To suggest people were defacing the Terry Fox statute is completely wrong. I think those are inappropriate comments. I don't think they helped. So maybe if you could tell us why you thought that was appropriate, if you still think that's appropriate now, because I don't think that helps the conversation. Those were wrong statements. And anyway,
sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I will. It's been 3 years, so I don't remember the exact posts that were happening at the time. In the sense of, I'm pretty sure I'd seen images of the statue in particular being impacted, but
right. It had a Canadian flag on it. That's
I feel like I'd seen more, but I'll be honest. Since it's been 3 years, I'd have to go back and take a look and see what I could find.
It could tell you 100%.
Okay, no, I appreciate that.
There would be criminal charges.
I think there were pretty clear pictures of folks with a Nazi flag, though. I don't think that was I saw numerous photos, not just from legacy media. I think from folks in that space.
And so, if you watch the video where it was,
yeah,
they shamed the person and told them to leave. So exactly what you were saying in post.
Yeah, and I think
it was a one-off person out of 100,000 people.
Yeah, and I think that'd be good. And I think what I didn't see, and again, maybe it just wasn't shared, maybe I couldn't find it in the right algorithm, it didn't hit me, is where was that happening? I didn't see that. I didn't hear about that. I didn't get information that suddenly, folks were really trying to say, hey, you're not, this is not what we're about. You got to get out of here. This is not acceptable. where was that type of message? And again, maybe it existed. I genuinely don't know. I would have loved to have seen it and heard it, but
It's
I
everywhere.
wasn't.
Yeah.
Sorry?
It's everywhere.
Great. Yeah. And in that case, I think that'd be really encouraging to see. And I think that's important because you need to make sure that, again, back to our just last item we were just discussing, is that, that, one person who is coming at it from a completely different space can really tarnish the whole conversation. It can discourage people from being involved in the first place. It can create a very negative situation. And so I'm glad to hear that, yeah, if people are doing that, that's good. I'm glad you said you were there and listening in and heard people getting rid of that person. So that's what I would want to see.
Right. Yeah, because it just went further that the history of the organizers is well known. This is your commentary. I would never get caught anywhere close. So the organizers and the protesters I was involved with said this is a peaceful event. This is respect the police, all of that. But none of that I noticed was shared. And going back to how we started is engaging with our citizens. Is I suspect that about 30% of your own constituents in Edmonton shared the views of the convoy at that time, at that very time you made those comments. So how do you think that your constituents that had that same view, and then it's grown, I think, since that people accept and thank and are appreciative of what the protesters did, but the 30% that were in support at the time that you made those comments, how do you think that they felt when you made those comments online to them?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, it's something that I actually ran into folks like that when I would go door knocking afterwards, right? As mentioned, that was a couple months after the 2021 election, but I go door knocking typically every month. So I was out in communities, knocking on doors, going to community events, and I would run into not a ton of people, but some people who were more supportive of what that was going on there. And we would have sort of the same conversation to say, hey, this is what I had a concern with. Here's what I saw. Here's some images. Here's what I had information on. I don't think that's something we should be striving towards. And
for what exactly? Are you talking about the images of the racist, but what about the hundreds of thousands of images that weren't like that? So I want to be clear about, is it you that were showing the images to the people, or were the people showing images to you?
I think it's a combination, right? I mean, I had people who would share things that they saw, which was great. I would share what I saw, have access to that, and we'd have dialogue about it. It didn't come up a lot of the doors, to be honest. I can think of maybe 10 to 20 conversations I had around that time. But in the end, the biggest thing was to actually have a conversation. And so, got a few phone calls, got a few emails, and almost every one of those is one that we would then engage in a longer conversation. I'd explain where my head was at, get their perspective on things, and then we would continue on. And so, yeah, overall, I found it, there are going to be people who disagree with me, and that's fine, and disagree with my perspective on that. But I never sort of shunned somebody. I had a more prominent example, maybe about what was it, a little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, about this conversation around this idea of 15-minute cities. And I went on and talked about to people how no, like this is all about land use. It has nothing to do with actually restriction of movement. But I try not to vilify folks that felt that they were going to be locked in by their municipal council or provincial government or federal government. I tried to then have a conversation and say, well, why do you how did you come to that point where you think that's going to happen? And then we would talk about the actual policies, and we talk about the actual written legislation and how it works. We talk about what's able to be done and what's not. And so instead of sort of shunning someone for it, I did try to make it clear to people that no, that's not true. And I publicly talked about that. But rarely is it trying to be saying, okay, no, you're wrong, and then never follow up with a conversation. Because I think there's the difference, right? If you just tell somebody that you're wrong, or you believe that they're wrong, without being willing to actually hear from them, I think then there's just that wall that goes up, right? If somebody just told me I'm wrong, you're going to get defensive. I get it. Like, I get defensive. I'd much rather somebody say, hey, that's not true, but I'd like to actually talk it through with you. Can go a lot better. And so that's how I've handled most of these things over the years. So whether it's that, whether it's the convoy, whether it's, issues in 2015 when we talked about infill, bike lanes. There's lots of good examples where the best way to solve it, the best way to address it is to actually just be willing to sit down and hear them out and talk through what you posted. Yeah. The post might generate some interest and then be willing to actually have a follow-up conversation.
Well, yeah, just going to when you said words matter, I think that maybe that would be something I would encourage elected officials before jumping to conclusions or vilifying citizens, because I think that's the worst part. Is vilifying citizens, whether or not they're, doing it the most diplomatic way or not. They're expressing their view. They did it in a large number. And to put that down, I don't think that it was appropriate. I think that elected officials should have listened at that time, because clearly there was something wrong. Clearly there was a message that was being missed. Clearly elected officials on all levels weren't listening to some people. And I think that caused what happened, and I think it'll be one time in history, but I do hope elected officials can learn from that and take a moment before they, vilify citizens for engaging. And like I said, I'm trying to elevate the conversation, so maybe we're hopefully never in that position again, but that can't be on me. I think elected officials to take a higher step is
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, that was a really great conversation, Andrew. I really appreciate that. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch on before we wrap this up.
Just one, and it's only because I know you didn't want to touch on it too much because you did talk about it briefly with Anne, but because it's municipal and that's where my role is, I wanted to give an example and just expand on the bike lane piece of it, because I heard that conversation you had with Anne, and I think she talked about it. I think you touched on this in your conversation with her around, there's this conversation around, does a decision, does it mean when you've made a decision that you're not listening to somebody, or somebody just doesn't get the answer that they want? And so I wanted to, pick bike lanes for an example, because I think there's a great example of when I first got onto council, just a month before I got elected, there was a terrible bike lane that was installed on 95th Ave in the West End, and there were a couple of other ones across the city. And I say terrible, even as somebody that bikes every day, because it was a painted line on a road that moved about 20,000 cars a day. And so the natural reaction from a lot of folks is you're taking away a lane of traffic on a really busy road to put in a painted line bike lane that ended up never really getting more than 25 people, especially because there was a service road on the other side. So when I got onto council, I voted to remove it. And we made a decision at that point in time and say, it's not that we should never have active transportation infrastructure. It's just how you do it. It makes so much, is so much more important. And so why I give that example and why I talk about that is that, yeah, there are still people who don't believe you should ever spend $1 on bike lanes. And I'm going to disagree with those folks, because I think our responsibility is to make sure everyone has safe options to move throughout the city. But I think far more what I found from people is that not that they disagreed with ever spending on something like that, it's that they felt it was done so poorly. And so, take the downtown bike grid as a good example. When that came to be in 2015, the reason the roads that were picked is because there was a thorough analysis done, and it found that all of the roads that now have a bike lane are roads that are not commuter roads. So they're not roads that people generally use to get to and from the West End to other parts of the city. They are secondary roads that don't have a lot of traffic. And so to lose a lane of traffic on a secondary road really didn't have an impact on how people moved. And so there's an example why I shared that, because I remember hearing your conversation is that, yeah, there are people who would not like us to spend any money at all. I think there's a lot more people who say, I just want money to be spent better. And I think it's important to note that, now there are bike lanes that exist, and we're going to continue to expand, and we can debate if the amount is the right amount. But I think time after time since 2015, what you've seen is now installation of bike lanes on roads that are typically parallel, but not on the main road anymore, because there's a recognition that there's still a lot of people who are going to drive and they need to have good infrastructure. But we also want to encourage other options, right? If you only ever invest in one mode, and you see that in a number of cities, you're never going to build your way out of congestion. And so you need to provide alternatives. So I remember hearing that conversation, and I think the one thing that I felt was missing from that was the fact that now, if you actually look at the bike infrastructure, if you go and map out where the city's built this, it's not on the roads that folks are commuting on.
Yeah.
It's on the roads in the West End that people need to get into the downtown. They're on secondary roads. So to me, that's one of those situations where folks can coexist, where we can have a win-win, but you need to be willing to actually dig into that. So I really enjoyed that conversation you had with Anne, and I wanted to add to it as somebody that was around for that entire process since the beginning of the installations, and a month before the first one went in.
And I'm with you that obviously I think the conversation needs to be around better spending all the time, every single way. I think 2 points, given you started this.
Yeah, absolutely.
One is it was getting shoved down our throats by claims, by like ad nauseum. And I think that is just annoying. Number one. And like without...
Can I ask what did you find was getting shoved down your throat when it came to that? Like, because I think back to when I was on
that we're doing this because this is what we need to, like, people need to have, okay, if it's the responsible and the right thing to do and it makes sense, lay it out. Like, you don't need to and then, like, I'll be honest, like, all I've ever seen councillors put on their Instagram is them riding the bike lanes. Okay, again, if it's that good, and then you don't have to advertise it like it's the end all and be all. So that's like, it's just like, to me, I'm very common sense. Like, if it makes sense, great. I hope you did your like homework, but I don't think you did. I don't even think you did yet. And I'll explain to you, Andrew, and I did speak with Anne about it a little bit, is that the city of Edmonton is doing everything at once. So, and I said this, the LRT, the bike lanes, so much money, and both of those will cancel each other. I live on 102. There is a bike lane on my road. Fine. At the same time, and at one point, I owned 2 businesses on Jasper Avenue. At the same time, or just after the bike lanes are done, you expanded the sidewalks to make them more user-friendly. At the same time, on 104, you're putting in LRT. I don't get it. There's been some suggestions that Edmonton wants to follow Amsterdam. I don't know if anybody from the city of Edmonton has been to Amsterdam, because Amsterdam has a busy road like Jasper Avenue that's expanded, and even motor vehicles are on those, or like scooters are allowed to be on those. And there's cafes, people are sitting there, there's high traffic on foot, there's high traffic bikes, there's even scooters. Here, we've expanded Jasper, literally nobody is there, and now businesses on Jasper have to now shovel bigger sidewalks that nobody is using. You've diminished the lane on Jasper, then you throw the bike lane on 102, where I see all of the traffic, foot and bike, so that seems successful, great. And now you're also putting on 104 the LRT. So Jasper Ave is dead, in my view. I don't think that anything the city has done has helped to improve it. It looks terrible. It doesn't have people. It doesn't have traffic. It's sat. All the traffic was diverted to 102 because, like you said, you took it off the main roads. I don't know what is the right decision, but I don't see the city took all of the factors, including these 3 I just said, really thought it through on a long-term plan. It seems like we need to do this. We got to get it done. Citizens will appreciate this later. The end. That's how I feel as a citizen of Edmonton.
And that may be, I appreciate that you sharing that, because I think, there's a good example of how can the city, and I think we need to make sure the city is trying to more actively engage. Because I remember, I have family members that live, I imagine, close to where you live. If you're on 102nd, you might be very close to where one of my family members lives. And we've got, before Jasper Ave even got started, there were years of work with the Downtown Business Association, with the local community leagues. They did open houses, they did engagement. I mean, think about the work, and I think Anne might have even mentioned this, is that, they piloted something on Jasper Avenue before they did anything permanent. And thank goodness they did, because the feedback was, hey, we don't really like this. And so they made some pretty substantial changes from what was there.
But still went ahead with it, I think. Like, they made changes, but still threw in these big sidewalks, put in nobody uses it. It was a massive waste of money, it looks like.
And I guess that's the piece is that, so there's an example of where, I don't know if you had gone to those public meetings when that was underway, because I know when the decision came to us, we had letters from the community leagues. We had businesses that had come and talked about wanting to create more opportunities. So if you have that bigger space, maybe you can put a patio out on there. But with a clear message, and I think this is why on Jasper Ave in particular, you're right, there was a lot of work done. But one thing that didn't change is there wasn't a reduction in the number of vehicle travel lanes on that road. Well, there was reduction of where some of the parking can go, but the actual 4-lane of travel still exists, right?
But
And
there was 6. And then they did the curve out.
the bus could use the 6th lane, and so that was the biggest change, is that the bus had to shift to using the main with a bus pull-in. But the before was still that there was parking during rush hour, right? Those were still 4-lane roads with the bus being able to use the outside lane. And the original plan when they were talking about Jasper Ave was to actually reduce the total number of lanes overall. And through the pilot, through the test, through the engagement, through the feedback, that's when you got to that final decision to say, hey, you can still have a wider sidewalk. You don't have to, at the same time, though, pull away from that infrastructure, because that is going to be a commuter road for a very long time. It's going to be sort of the main commuter road if you're coming in from West Edmonton or Southwest Edmonton, as an example. But I mean, this is the challenge, is that even with that adjustment based off pilots, based off engagements, there are going to be some people who find that's still not the right. They would have just rather seen it replaced exactly as is, just a like for like replacement. But then there were others who were saying that they don't want that. And you run into that situation where sooner or later you still got to make a call. Some people are going to feel that they weren't heard. I think everyone was heard. It's just a decision has to be made. You're not going to always please everyone. And in that one, there was a situation where either choice you make, somebody's going to feel disappointed because they didn't get the outcome they wanted. Some wanted just a like for like, some wanted enhancements. And there were adjustments made. But I think there was a good example of, I don't think that was rushed through. There were a few years of work on that to get to that point. You might still not like the answer, but it wasn't due to a lack of work I actually think we're missing that as a city. I don't think we're doing that level of engagement as much anymore, but there was a ton of it on that one.
Yeah, like I just said, it's not being utilized. When I mean it was pushed, it was done when, all the traffic now, because you put in a bike lane and because it's more walk friendly, it is being utilized more. So I don't think that was part of the it just couldn't be, because you go on Jasper Ave and you just don't see the traffic there. I actually feel safer walking on 102.
Oh yeah.
Because there's so much more people. I don't feel safe on Jasper Ave, so I feel incredibly badly for all of the businesses there. And from 109 to 124, there is no business association. So there was nobody advocating for them from the business perspective. So, and yet it was, like I said, pushed through. Maybe that could have stayed on hold if it was being talked about for years. That could have been done in 10 years after bike lane was put in place, after 102. Now let's reassess Jasper Ave and see where things are. So anyway, I just think that's when I'm saying it just doesn't seem like we're taking into consideration everything we're doing. That might have been a great project 10, 20, 30 years from now, but it didn't do anything now. And it was just a big waste of money in my view.
Yeah. And
caused so much tension. And then it's again, like the city's not listening. Like it just didn't need to be on the table at all.
Well, and I think and this goes back to how can the city communicate better? Because a really good reason of why that work had to happen is the utility infrastructure underneath the road was at end of life. We couldn't wait 10 more years. We couldn't wait 5 more years. But how well was that known?
Redesign the whole thing. Anyway, like I said, I had a bit.
I hear you. No, I appreciate that.
I watched it all. I watched how
excuse me,
city workers were not very, great sometimes parking where they're not supposed to be. And so that aggravates people.
For sure, it does.
I used to do expropriation both on for landowners, and I very briefly worked for the city. And expropriation, as you know, and for viewers, is when the government takes land. And I think that how the city disrupted the businesses on Jasper Avenue was awful. And like I said, no benefits right now for these businesses that went through all that hassle. So anyway, there again, overall, lots to do, lots to talk about. We could literally be talking for, oh my gosh, 30
I
an
know
hour.
it's been a long time.
I try to keep these down to 60 minutes, but there
My
we go.
fault. I'm the one talking all the time.
You brought up bike lanes, and it's a topic of a thorn. But like again, and I hope at least you could feel it, or you can appreciate what I said.
Yeah.
Like, I want the city to be better, and I actually I laugh when people call me right wing, because I used to also be called in Edmonton a tree hugger because I used to represent landowners. I am somebody that is trying to, well, number one, I advocate for people, and usually they're vulnerable people, like landowners in Alberta or people that are being disparaged in Ottawa by their elected officials. It's not an easy place sometimes, and I think that we need to elevate the conversation and have these discussions. And putting it on to elected officials to do a little better and try to recognize that sometimes people aren't as sophisticated, but that's where it's an opportunity to engage and educate.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for that, Andrew. I appreciate it very much. And hopefully we'll see you in person, and maybe we could do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.